The next one's really fun. I hope all of you know who Michelle Lichens is. Does everybody know who Charlie Sykes is? Okay. And if you have any doubt about the conservative dominance of messaging, and I do this every day. Listen to Charlie Sykes for a half hour a day. No, I'm serious. Right? You have to start understanding that they believe they're moral, they believe they're right, and that they are very, very smart. Charlie Sykes is a very, very smart man. Okay? Listen and start identifying these core conservative values that he's talking about. He's terribly consistent. Right? And then you start to think about, well, okay, if I were sitting there with Charlie, what would I say? And it's hard because you want to respond with the facts. You want to be like, talking about, the tons of runoff that CAFOs, have into the streams, and you want to talk about test scores, and you want to talk about, all this, economics and jobs and all that. But no, what would you say to him? And it's very powerful. So they're talking about, this is going into the whole, provisional voting, absentee voting, that whole thing. And so you're going to hear Michelle Lichens say something about it, and then it's going to go to a so-called progressive blogger who's terrible on this segment, and then Charlie says something about it. And I want you to listen really closely about what they say, and also think about how the voting rights groups in the state talked about that issue, because there was a very specific way they messaged the voter absentee voting issue. It's very instructive.
The rest of the state. Okay, Michelle.
I think this was definitely required. We need to set standards for all municipalities. I live in a township where you could argue that the farmers work 14-hour days all week long, and it's difficult for them to get to the polls. So we have a part-time. So if you're not able to make it to the polls on election day, or during the hours that they're prescribing now, you will always have that opportunity to vote by an absentee ballot.
Alex, yeah, I'm with Michael. It just doesn't make sense. We want to put this rural or suburban template on the city. Volunteer fire departments don't work for the city. So we have 600,000 people, hundreds of thousands more people. It takes longer.
We've always had, okay, but this is not a new idea. We've always had election day. You could make the same argument that having an election day that goes from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. suppresses the vote of people who can't get there until 8:15, and yet this has never been an issue. Is there any person in the state of Wisconsin who will not be able to vote? If you can't make it from 8 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, there is still the mail-in absentee ballot. Nobody's right to vote has been restricted in any way whatsoever. So what?
So this was an interesting issue as to how progressive groups involved in voting rights messaged this. Does anybody remember what this was about? What the progressive groups, what it was about? And it was primarily in Milwaukee. No. The weekend absentee voting. Right. You remember what it was about? It was about race.
Yeah.
Right?
Because the black churches would have their own.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Right? So it became a racial issue. And I think strategically that was a mistake. Because this should have been a statewide issue. So Michelle Lichens and Charlie Sykes both kind of hit on the same thing. But what was the conservative values, the conservative framework?
If you're disciplined, you will make plans to vote.
Yes!
That's it.
Discipline.
Right.
Which, here's what's really interesting, right? So if you're in Milwaukee working on a voting rights issue, and the conservatives are saying, look, this is about discipline. If you really want to vote, and do the morally right thing, you'll get to the polls. What does that say about the African American community in the conservative frame, right? Exactly. And it reaffirms the conservative hierarchy, right? The conservative hierarchy of whites above blacks, Christians above non-Christians, men above women, right? It fed right into that.
They even have these odd jobs where they might be, the 9 to 5 people are the better off people. They're probably better educated and more more decisions to get a 9 to 5 job with a car. They have a car so they get their own babysitter.
Yep.
Other people have these odd jobs. What are they doing in the middle of the night? They can't get up.
See that? Yes, that's right. And yet, isn't it hypocritical for Michelle Litchens to talk about farmers? You know, when certainly there were farmers who worked day and night, all week, who would call their local clerk and say, hey, look, I need to cast an absentee ballot. Can I meet you on Saturday to have a love it, right? Right? So, conservative, right, it was all about discipline. But, you know, you get to the polls. It's your moral obligation. Yes?
There's an implied suggestion that some votes are better than other votes.
Of course.
Are worth more, are more legitimate.
Absolutely. Right? And that also goes right along with the social hierarchy. You know, the socioeconomic hierarchy. It validates that. So, progressives, what's this voting issue about?
Maximizing our resources.
No.
Maximizing opportunity.
One word.
Freedom.
Freedom. Bingo. This would have been the best value to message voting rights on. Anything. In fact, I wouldn't even say voting rights. I would say voting freedom.
Equality.
Voting equality. Absolutely. The purpose of government is to protect and empower. Right? Government is tasked with a moral obligation to protect and empower the public. We have a moral obligation to empower people to vote. This state has a long legacy of empowering people and expanding the freedom to vote. Michelle Litchens, with all due respect, why do you want to take away those people's freedoms? That's how they're voting. I mean, I have some other things here that maybe dig a little deeper. Voting is necessary to democracy and freedom.
Equality there for us to use, because they can say, oh, some people are being elected.
Oh, no, equality.
Equal. Okay, they wouldn't.
Equality of opportunity is fantastic. They may not agree to it, right? Because they have the hierarchy, but it's good to say it because remember, okay, to influence public discourse on an issue, right, we need to sway about 10% of the population. That's it. Right? So you start small. Start with your neighbors, start with your friends, start with your family. That's how you change public discourse. And then it snowballs. Any legislation to restrict voter access is anti-freedom. Nobody said that. Not a single person said that. This gets to what I said. I mean, you go back, the first constitution of this state gave the vote to women and African Americans. Did you know that? No. It was voted down because the only people that could vote for the Constitution were white male property owners. And the first Constitution of Wisconsin also outlawed commercial banking. We would have had a state-owned bank. Again, it was voted down primarily by the Milwaukee corporate business interests and the banksters, because they were the ones that could vote. So our state was one of the first to ratify the 19th Amendment. It was the first state to give the African American the right to vote. And it was not confirmed until a state Supreme Court case 5 years later. We have a proud tradition of voting freedom in this state. I wish somebody had said this. What, they talk all about, oh, these rural areas, we can't afford to have a clerk there on weekends. We can't. Oh, yeah? Show that you support voting freedom by funding early voting statewide. There were Dems in the Senate that I begged to try to put out an amendment like that. But, it would have had no hope of passing. But just to get it in public discourse, right? Senator Grothman, don't you think that your constituents and the clerks in your county would love to get funding to be open on Saturdays for early voting? Why won't you support this? And make an answer to that in public. See, that's what changing public discourse is about. Okay, we're good on time.